Hello friends, I'm Dr. Kuldeep Mohadikar. In this video, I will present William Wordsworth's The Immortality Ode. The Immortality Ode is one of the most famous poems in English literature. In the whole series of Wordsworth's poems, it is the greatest and that to which all others lead up. Wordsworth reached one of the highest peaks of the English poetry of the Romantic period with this ode. Indeed, it is the high water mark of poetry in 19th century. Originally, the poem did not bear any title, being simply designated as Ode. Noting the uncertainty of some critics, Henry Crabb Robinson suggested to Wordsworth that there should be a descriptive title of the work to guide the reader to a perception of its drift. The poet then deliberately chose the title Ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood to emphasize what he conceived to the essential meaning. An understanding of the poem's imaginative source and meaning is not helped by the subtitle. It can be referred to simply as the ode without risk of confusion with other odes which have their own fuller titles. Referring to the sources of the ode in his personal life, Wordsworth observes, I quote, "This was composed during my residence at Town End, Grasmere. 2 years at least passed between the writing of the first 4 stanzas and the remaining part. To the attentive and competent reader, the whole sufficiently explains itself. But there may be no harm in adverting here to particular feelings or experiences of my own mind on which the structure of the poem partly rests. Nothing was more difficult for me in childhood than to admit the notion of death as a state applicable to my own being. I unquote. I have said elsewhere, I quote, a simple child that lightly draws its breath and feels its life in every limb, what should it know of death? I unquote. But it was not so much from the source of animal vivacity that my difficulty came, as from a sense of the indomitableness of the spirit within me. I used to brood over the stories of Enoch and Elijah and almost persuade myself that whatever might become of others, I should be translated in something of the same way to heaven. With a feeling congenial to this, I was often unable to think of external things as having external existence. And I communed with all that I saw as something not part from but inherent in my own immaterial nature. Many times while going to school, I grasped at a wall or tree to recall myself from this abyss of idealism to the reality. At that time, I was afraid of mere processes. In later periods of life, I have deplored, as we have all reason to do, a subjugation of an opposite character and have rejoiced over the remembrances as it expressed in the lines obstinate questionings, etc. To that dream-like vividness and splendor with invest objects of sight in childhood, everyone, I believe, if he would look back, could bear testimony, and I did not dwell upon it here, but having in the poem regarded it as a presumptive evidence of a prior state of existence, I think it right to protest against a conclusion which has given pain to some good and pious persons, that I meant to inculcate such a belief. It is far too shadowy a notion to be recommended to faith as more than an element in our instincts of immortality. But let us bear in mind that though the idea is not advanced in revelation, there is nothing there to contradict it, and the fall of man presents an analogy in its favor. Accordingly, a pre-existent state has entered into the popular creeds of many nations, and among all persons acquainted with classical literature is known as an ingredient in Platonic philosophy. Archimedes said that he could move the world if he had a point whereon to rest his machine. Who has not felt the same aspirations as regards the world of his own mind, having to wield some of its elements? When I was impelled to write this poem on the immortality of the soul, I took hold of notion of pre-existence as having sufficient foundation in humanity for authorizing me to make for my purpose the best use of it I could as a poet, Wordsworth said. So the ode has several themes. It depicts the visionary experiences of childhood, the fading of youthful vision with the advance of age, the natural piety that binds our days each to each, and the philosophical compensations of maturity. It also expresses the idea of pre-existence and the hope of immortality, not as an illusion but as a master light. The poet seems to have laid emphasis on the theme of immortality, which is placed absolutely in the foreground by the title of the poem. The central theme is immortal nature of the human spirit, intuitively known by the child, partly forgotten by the growing man, but to be known once more in maturity through intense experience of heart and mind. I quote, but this is not to say that the doctrine of prenatal existence is set forth deliberately by Wordsworth as an accepted belief. Southey titled the balance away when he called the poem the Ode on Pre-Existence, a dark subject darkly handled. I unquote. Wordsworth's prosaic and scrupulous statement is a good answer to the question we are often constrained to ask of a poet: do you really believe what you say? He says that he has not meant to inculcate a belief in a prior state of existence. It is far too shadowy a notion to be recommended to faith as more than an element in our instincts of immortality. The poem falls into three parts. The first four stanzas, which form the first part, put the fact there had passed a glory from the earth, and in the last two lines of them ask the explanation of it. Stanza 5 to 8 constitute the second part. This part gives the explanation in the form of the doctrine of reminiscence. The third part, stanzas 9 to 11, is an attempt to vindicate the value of a life from which vision has fled. As Bora puts it, I quote, the three parts of the ode deal in turn with a crisis, an explanation, and a consolation, and in all, three Wordsworth speaks of what is most important and most original in his poetry. I unquote. The three parts of the ode are not harmoniously blended together, thus the second part of the poem is in effect an interpolation alien to opening and closing sections. The poem is grand in its design but lacks the seamless unity of Tintern Abbey. Like so much of the best of Wordsworth, the Immortality Ode is a piece of spiritual autobiography. Wordsworth wrote it between 1803 and 1806, so it was partly contemporary with the prelude, of which its substance might have formed a part. In this ode, the poet unlocks his heart and describes a crisis in his intellectual development. In his childhood, he lived in the glory and freshness of the sense in the immediate report given by the sense of principle of joy in the world. But with advancing years, this report comes to be fitful and dim. The things that the poet had seen, he now can see no more. Wordsworth's loss of vision marks the decline in poetic power, which begins with ending of the ode. Referring to Wordsworth's loss of vision, Bora observes, I quote, he lived not only with but on nature, and what he prized most in it was its capacity to open to him another world through vision. It is this which he has lost, perhaps not entirely, but enough to cause him a deep anxiety. It is idle to ask too closely what Wordsworth means by the visionary gleam or the glory and the dream. If it were simple, he would probably have expressed it in simple words. But because it is complex and unfamiliar, he uses image and symbol. I unquote. In the Immortality Ode, Wordsworth laments the loss of vision, but he makes also the compensating discovery of new and soberer power, springing out of the harsher realities of man's inhumanity of man. I quote, the clouds that gather round the setting sun do take a sober coloring from an eve that had kept watch over man's mortality, a philosophical poem. I unquote. Like Tintern Abbey, the Immortality Ode is a great philosophical poem. The first four stanzas of the poem are lyrical and emotional, offering no reasons or explanations. But in the fifth stanza, the poet embarks upon philosophy. The middle part of the poem gives Wordsworth's philosophy of childhood. Here, more than anywhere else in his works, he tries to reduce his scattered impressions and convictions into an orderly system. His philosophy has been compared to Plato's, but it is in fact less of an abstract system than a description of his own personal experience of life and the process of aging. Briefly, his theory seems to be something like this: the newborn soul does not come from nowhere, out of nothingness, but from some other ill defined country, from afar, from an imperial palace. This is a fairly common conviction held by mystics of various religions. The title, the little child, still has clear memories and visions of this other heavenly place. But as he grows older, they begin to fade. Earth does her best. Earth does her best to make him forget this other place and its glories, and the child himself tries to hurry on this process of forgetfulness, longing to be grown up, playing at being a grow up, imitating adults in his games. Eventually, he does grown up and forget, though he goes through a period when he still has rare glimpses of memory and vision, though unable to keep in constant contact with his sense of glory. When he is fully mature, even these glimpses are lost and fade into the light of common day. On one level, this is a plain description of Wordsworth's own progress from childhood through youth to a somewhat bleak and disillusioned middle age. It is the same story that the prelude tells. It is only Wordsworth's attempts to make his own experiences into a general philosophy applicable to all men and true of the whole human condition that make the ode confusing. Wordsworth was no philosopher, though he felt he ought to be one. His mind never dealt as easily in abstract ideas as it did with some massive single physical symbol like the leech gatherer. Like Tinton Abbey, the Immortality Ode is a difficult poem. Many readers have felt the poem to be confused or not completely unified. There are, if we look closely, two quite different intimations of immortality, whereas one implies the mortality of nature, questionings, I quote, of sense and outward things, fallings from us vanishing, blank misgivings of a creature moving about in world not realized. The other implies its immortality, the primal sympathy which having been must ever be. I unquote. In stanza 9, especially when Wordsworth says that his thanksgiving are less for the visionary gleam than for the visionary dreariness, and goes on to describe the latter as, I quote, those first affections, those shadow recollections, which be they what they may, are at the fountain light of all our day, are at the master light of all our seeing. I unquote. It is hard to follow him. He seems to be willfully confusing moments of darkness, fear which nature seemed alien to child with moments of splendor and beauty which first developed the child's affections and drew them to nature in a more intimate way. The poem is far from easy. The term immortality means death negated. It is a dramatic word, may be equated with life itself, provided some recognition of death is incorporated. Such recognition our ode gives, celebrating life victorious over death. In poetic study, we must never limit too closely a vast unknowledge which the poem itself is created to define. So the Wordsworth's ode, like Shakespeare's Pericles or Shelley's Prometheus, is a vision of immortality or life victorious. It need have nothing to say about life after death. It is rather a vision of essential, all-conquering life, bird music, all young life, and preeminently the child. In this ode, we get a double vision of childhood. The childhood that we see being busily lived through by children and which we ourselves lived through, and the childhood which we carry within us like a memory, and which, while grounded in our earliest years, stays with us into adult life for good or evil. As Alec King puts it, I quote, these two childhoods may be called for convenience visible childhood and invisible childhood. We are mostly aware of the visible childhood in children. It is the mother as is understood, who knows best the invisible childhood, who in her passion, piety or affection knows the shape upon her lap as a presence that symbolizes all heavenly glory and that mocks man's enterprise. I unquote. Wordsworth began the ode at a time when he was exercised by two different ideas about nature. In the first place, The fitful returns of his youthful vision made him ask why they were not more frequent and more secure. This made him anxious and uneasy and prompted the first stanzas of the ode. In the second place, he believed that in moral inspiration of nature, he had found something to take the place of his visions, and this discovery gave to the ode its positive and consoling character. Such, no doubt, was his state of mind when he conceived the outline of the ode. But we may ask why this issue was forced so powerfully on Wordsworth in the spring of 1802, since he was aware of it when he wrote Tintern Abbey 4 years before. No doubt in the interval he found that his visionary gift was not so dead as he had thought, but still at times returned to him. No doubt too he saw more clearly how much comfort was to be found in his moral conception of nature. Nonetheless, something must have happened to press the issue on him with a new and inescapable insistence. Both Wordsworth and the Platonists emphasize recollection as a basis for believing in the dignity of man's soul. In Plato's Phaedo, for example, Socrates rebuts Simmias' phenomenalism by appealing to the doctrine of reminiscence. The argument in this dialogue, a favorite of Wordsworth, is related both to the refutation of materialism and to the hope of immortality. Likewise, in Phaedrus, Socrates maintains that the young soul fresh in the world has the most visionary perceptions. It seems likely that Wordsworth, perhaps under the guidance of Coleridge, would have been attracted to the Phaedrus because it contains much concerning immortality and reminiscence. Similarly, Proclus, who probably influenced the ode, argued that in corporeality of thought, that is, its independence of the perishable body, is shown by the mind's turning back upon it in the act of memory. The very ability to remember, Proclus maintained, is inexplicable upon the basis of materialistic philosophy. Possibly, Wordsworth had in mind this argument when he wrote, I quote, "But for those first affections, those shadowy recollections, which be they what they may, are at the fountain light of all our day, are at a master light of all our seeming." I unquote. Wordsworth evidently felt that his conclusions were valid even if the recollections were not reminiscences of pre-existence, for it is the mysterious power of memory and not merely the reminiscence of a previous existence that attests to the spiritual nature of man. The Immortality Ode is essentially a free Pindaric poem of the type established by Cole and perfected by Dryden, but the form created for a Baroque celebration of public themes has moved into an entirely new dimension. Wordsworth owed much to Dryden's practice, although he sometimes, in his criticism, spoke slightingly of that poet. The freedom and variety of rhythm which Dryden employed in Alexander's Feast to express the varying human passions which the lyre of Timotheans could awaken or allay now begins the vehicle for shifting moods of the subjective romantic poet. The diction of this poem is supply molded to the poet's purpose of his thoughts, moves from stage to stage. Matthew Arnold found something declamatory in the ode, but those phrases which might taken into isolation deserve that epithet. I quote, "The cataracts blow their trumpets to the steep, the heavens laugh with you in their jubilee, my head hath its coronal." I unquote, will be found to be right in their context, where the poet is forcing a joy which he does not feel, and his language accordingly receives rhetorical heightening when he cuts himself short with, I quote, "But there is a tree of many, one a single field, which I have looked upon, both of them speak of something that is gone." I unquote. He is once more in the vein of bare simplicity in which for him the bare truth is best told. The varied language of the ode, released as it is from the experimental purpose that purged that of the lyrical ballads, has touches of splendor and of a magic that belong to another mode altogether. It has upon it the stamp of that earlier ascetic discipline. The words tell his thought with a truth and simplicity that remains the groundwork of his poetic style. The dominant image through which the poet's sense of loss and recovery is expressed is that of light. Indeed, the imagery of light presides over the whole ode. there are two other major images, those of the sea and flowers. The flower image in one shape or another keeps threading its way through the ode till it comes to rest in quite beautiful lines of the close. I unquote, to me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. In this way, the Immortality Ode remains not merely the greatest, but the one really dazzlingly, supremely great thing Wordsworth ever did. Its theory has been scorned or impunged by some. Parts of it have even been called nonsense by critics of wit. But sound or unsound, sense or nonsense, it is poetry and magnificent poetry, from the first line to the last poetry, than which there is none better in any language. Poetry such as there is not perhaps more than a small volume full in all languages. That's all from my side on Wordsworth's Ode to Immortality, or we can call it the Immortality Ode. Thanks, friends.